Peace to you. This is lesson 2 of the chapter entitled The Emergence of Israel. Yesterday we stopped at the outspoken retort of the Pope, who said, "We cannot favor this movement." But now let's go on and find out exactly the details of what ensued. It seems like the movement moved on, and in spite of the Pope's remark. Herzl obtained his only real diplomatic success in his negotiations with the British government, whose able colonel minister, Joseph Chamberlain, caught something of Herzl's vision. With his help, and that of the British Jewish leaders, among them Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, who had previously avoided Herzl, but now noticed that Her Majesty's government was taking him seriously. The Zionist leader negotiated with the Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne, about assigning to the Jews a territory in the vicinity of El Arish on the Sinai Peninsula. Although disputed by Turkey, Egypt's suzerainty was sufficiently established for the British protectorate to allow colonization in this vicinity, but the trouble was the aridity of the land. The British government was soon induced to make another grand offer. It suggested that the Zionist movement undertake to colonize Jews in the British Crown colony of Uganda in East Africa. This underpopulated country, with a moderate climate because of its high elevation, could accommodate many Jewish colonists. Some British settlers there objected to Jewish mass immigration, but the government was prepared to overrule them. Herzl rightly considered this British offer a major victory. It represented the first public recognition by a major power of both the Jewish people's claim to separate territory and the World Zionist Organization as its authorized spokesman. Meanwhile, a revolt broke out among the Russian Zionists, led by Menachem, this is challenging, Ussishkin. Menachem Ussishkin. At a Kharkov meeting, the Russian leaders protested against any idea of colonizing Jews outside Palestine, and even rejected Herzl's argument that Uganda could at least serve as a preparation for the ultimate immigration to Palestine. After Herzl's death, the Uganda project was completely abandoned, but it left its traces in an important splinter group led by Israel Zangwill, which had favored acceptance of the British proposal and now formed a new Jewish territorial organization to continue to search for an appropriate territory in which to colonize Jews. The Zionist organization itself, which even before Herzl's death had included an articulate group of practical Zionists, now tempered its expectations of an internationally guaranteed charter in favor of less dramatic but more enduring practical colonization. Retaining much of the cultural program, the practical Zionists concentrated on the economic and educational expansion of the Yeshub. They were convinced that whatever the cost in money and effort, the creation of such strategic positions in the Holy Land would in the long run prove more fruitful than diplomatic negotiations. Apart from the practical Zionists who differed from the Herzlian group in method rather than goals, there emerged two other important factions, which, though they were to add to the richness of Zionist ideology, at the same time complicated the organizational tasks. The first formally recognized faction was the Mizrachi, which insisted upon building Zionism on the basis of the Orthodox religious tradition. The second faction, the Jewish socialists, had reconciled in their minds Jewish nationalism with their basic international ideals. And among them were devoted Zionists who felt that the ultimate solution of the Jewish question, even in the social sense, required the foundation of a Jewish homeland. These Zionist socialists soon split up into many subdivisions, the most influential of which were the Peol Zion, under the leadership of Ber Borachov, and the Ha-Poel Hazair under A.D. Gordon. The latter movement was altogether ready to forego Marxism and the class struggle, and to achieve the realization of its national as well as socialist programs through love and cooperation, and particularly through preaching its religion of labor. Whatever their party affiliations, all these Zionist groups cooperated, down to the outbreak of World War I, in enlarging and strengthening the Yeshub, particularly its agricultural segment, with the aid of such national institutions as the Anglo-Palestinian Bank and the Jewish National Fund. The Russian pogroms of 1903 and 1905 created a much greater demand for immigration to Palestine, and the second Aliyah, beginning in 1905, made more rapid headway than the first Aliyah of the Bilu, B-I-L-U. The Aliyah means to go up to the promised land, literally Aliyah, coming from the Arabic root Ali, meaning up high. The number of Jewish colonies, which by 1893 had reached 21, increased to 47 in 1914. Despite the Great Repression by Jamal Pasha during World War I, that's the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, they continued growing. So, at the beginning of the mandate in 1923, there were 74. At the same time, industrial endeavor received an even greater impetus. A regular urban proletariat, organized in strong labor unions, made its first appearance, as did the nucleus for a Jewish police and army, in the form of Hashomer, a volunteer National Guard which stood watch over the Jewish colonies against Arab raiders and marauders. Notice the wording here. Stood watch over the Jewish colonies against Arab raiders and marauders. In 1909, a few Jewish settlers built a new township on the sand dunes on the outskirts of Jaffa and named it Tel Aviv. In short, slowly but surely, there was emerging a small but self-contained, economically and culturally vigorous community, which could well form the nucleus for a future commonwealth. Palestine Mandate. The Yeshub and behind it the World Zionist Movement were in a strategic position to make use of the great crisis of World War I. Ber Borachov urged his followers to face reality in the midst of the war and wrote, "The practical colonization work in Palestine, with its experiences and sacrifices, its inevitable mistakes, has created those political facts which have paved the way for our present status. No matter how small and weak the Jewish colonies might be, no matter how great the shortcomings in their system of colonization, they did more towards enlightening the Jewish nation than 1,000 beautifully worded programs and diplomatic negotiations. A fallen Shomer plays a greater role in the realization of Zionism than all declarations." I looked up the meaning of Shomar. It's martyr. The best guarantee of Zionism lies not in a charter, but in the Zionist movement. Ironically, within half a year after those words were written, the foundations for the charter were laid. The Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917. To understand this first Allied commitment, we must realize that for a long time, World War I hung in the balance. Before the United States' entry into the war, the European Entente and the Central Powers, in particular, were on the lookout for partisans. The sympathies of Jews, especially in the United States, might, so it was thought, prove decisive for the outcome of the war. Jews were reputed to have control over vast capital. Reputed. Yes, vast capital. And it was Lloyd George who, at the inception of the war, had predicted that it would be the last silver bullet which would determine the victor. Not only the man in the street, but statesmen and financiers were prone to exaggerate the size, power, and solidarity of Jewish finance capital. It was still the day, we must not forget, of great and influential private bankers, such as J.P. Morgan. So the effort to capture the goodwill of the Jews, especially those in neutral nations, appeared worthwhile. But there was a complicating factor here, owing to the West's alliance with Tsarist Russia, the arch foe of the Jewish people. It mattered little that at the outbreak of the war, the Russian Generalissimo Nikolaevich addressed an appeal to my beloved Jews. However, with Turkey's entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers, the Allies could bid for Jewish support, with the promise of a Jewish national home in Palestine. When victorious, they would proceed to dismember the Ottoman Empire. True, the Allied statesmen had also been secretly negotiating with the Arabs, whom they incited to rebel against their Turkish overlords. In these secret negotiations, above all with Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, such British representatives as Hogarth and McMahon made promises rather vague and far from binding concerning the extent of the Arab state, which was to arise from the Ottoman ruins. The responsible British ministers knew of these negotiations, yet went ahead with their public commitment in behalf of the Jewish national home. It was an idealistically tinged realism which prompted Lloyd George and Arthur James Balfour, his foreign secretary, to go on record as favoring the Zionist idea. In 1936, Lloyd George himself testified publicly in Parliament that the Declaration had been issued in full realization in Parliament that the Declaration... No, I just read a sentence twice. Sun's going down. Perhaps I should stop here. I will, soon. In full realization of Britain's own interest. Another member of the War Cabinet, Winston Churchill, likewise stressed its adoption as the result of the dire need of the war, and with the object of promoting the general victory of the Allies, for which they expected and received valuable and important assistance. The Declaration, moreover, soon secured the approval of the other Allied powers, especially France, Italy, and somewhat more guardedly, the United States. The text betrayed the protracted negotiations which preceded its promulgation. To pacify non-Zionist Jewish circles, which included the addressee of the Declaration, Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the British government made it clear that by establishing the Jewish national home, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. Then, as later, much ink was spilled about the dual allegiances of the Jews. Only Gentiles, already predisposed to believe the worst of the Jews, evinced real concern about such divided loyalties, purportedly characteristic of all ethnic minorities, but this phantom has not been laid until today. Noteworthy, too, is the fact that the original formula suggested by the Zionist group was a pledge by the British government of support for Palestine as a Jewish national home. This was changed to read, "The establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people," and the way was thus left open for diverse interpretations. In fact, in a subsequent white paper in 1922, Winston Churchill argued that Britain had never expected Palestine to be as Jewish as England was Jewish. Still, the declaration marked the first definite recognition by a great power of the Jewish claim to Palestine. Jews all over the world hailed the declaration and its subsequent endorsements by other governments and leaders of public opinion as ushering in the ultimate realization of their ideal. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but looking back at the distance they had already traveled against tremendous odds, they felt convinced that the final success must be theirs by dint of hard work and sacrifice. As soon as the war was over, much of the Allied enthusiasm for the rebirth of Jewish people cooled off. At the peace conference, all ideals of national self-determination and of making the world safe for democracy withered away in the icy climate of power politics and insatiable greed for territorial expansion. Involved in daily tasks of administration and observing from narrow range the hostility of the Arab population, many officers of the Allenby staff and later civil administrators considered a Jewish national home utterly impracticable. Even those who were not from the outset pro-Arab or otherwise prejudiced against Jews often believed that their leaders in London had lost sight of the Palestinian realities. When the Crane Commission arrived in Palestine for an 8-day visit in the summer of 1919, its members were informed by the local officials that the plan was not working. Nevertheless, the statesmen reassembled in San Remo in 1920 and decided to establish a League of Nations mandate over Palestine and entrust its administration to Great Britain, which was to be obliged to implement the Balfour Declaration. As soon as the League was formed in 1922, Palestine was formally proclaimed a territory under an A mandate, that is, substantially a sovereign state in being, whose actual exercise of sovereignty was but temporarily suspended. When its population became ready for self-government to the native population. The provisions of the mandate contained in themselves the seeds of their destruction. On the one hand, like other mandates, the Palestinian provided for the early establishment of self-governing institutions, while on the other, its main import was the establishment of a Jewish national home and the encouragement of large-scale Jewish immigration. Under the conditions then existing in the country, these two propositions proved irreconcilable. Any democratically elected legislature would close the country to Jewish immigration and land purchases. It was of little help that Britain from the outset eliminated Transjordan from the area of Jewish colonization, separating it, for the first time in history, from Western Palestine. Britain's subsequent efforts to organize some sort of advisory legislative council with no Arab minority founded on the rock of Arab refusal. Here lay the crucial difficulty. It is not true, as frequently alleged, that Herzl and other Zionist leaders did not know of the existence of Arabs in the country, but they could not anticipate that after World War I, European nationalism would spread to the Arab world with such fury and intensity. The national movement, to be sure, had been underway since the days of Muhammad Ali and his son Ibrahim Pasha, but it had not really penetrated beyond intellectual circles. Nor were Zionists or Western statesmen fully cognizant of the atavistic Muslim view that a country conquered by the sword of Islam could only be taken away from her by the sword. With the glibness of European colonizers, Britons and Jews often underestimate the Orient's resistance to Western ways of life. While Arab nationalism meant ultimate westernization, the masses of falahin, that means peasantry, and their spiritual leaders resented the importation of Western ideas by Jewish colonists, who constituted not merely a thin layer of foreign bureaucrats, as in other colonial countries, but an important segment of the population. Further, the new ways invited emulation, and hence were doubly resented by the influential landlord class, and hence were doubly represented by the influential landlord class, which feared the introduction of revolutionary ideas among the country's oppressed peasantry. Thus, why do they always say oppressed peasantry? You know, I have to just tell you that Allah says in the Quran that He doesn't oppress an atom's weight. People oppress themselves. It means they don't depend on only Allah, and they don't do what He says. So we're wondering, were these oppressed peasantry praying 5 times a day? Back to history. Thus arose a strange coalition of various Arab groups, united only in their resentment at the new immigration and their opposition to the Jewish homeland. The result was the increasingly sanguinary clashes with the Jews in 1920, 1921, 1929, and especially 1936 to 1938. Here Zionist ideals clashed with bitter reality. That's enough for today, because I think my last lesson was too long, and so it's actually now 23 minutes. I did it again. Well, so be it. This is important information, because most people don't have the time or inclination or ability to find this sort of information easily accessible. So I suggest that you listen to this while riding in the car to work, or as you fall asleep, because it's very well written and very accurate, and I'm trying to be helpful here in supplying, may I say, a more moderate view than I don't want to say outright war, but that's what we're facing now. So perhaps the first step is understanding where things started and not making any more mistakes than have already been made. Inshallah, may Allah bring peace to the Middle East, and inshallah establish Palestine in the correct way. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.